Bang ding ding, trademark. He come out 6'7" tall. Bang ding ding, one is star. Bang dong ding dong ding dong ding dong ding dong ding dong ding. This is a perfect day.
Woke up to the sound of the garbage truck again. Upstairs neighbor's toilet's leaking on my head. Cars broke down, I missed the bus, there runs a 10. I had a feeling this was a day to stay in bed. I finally left my pad right under Jumbo's cloud roof. A police officer pulled out his gun and said, I said, sir, you got the wrong guy. I guess it's just a perfect day. It's just a perfect day. Na, 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 na,
Hey guys, welcome back to another great episode of Eggs. Today we have Jon Tobin. Jon is a graduate of the UCLA School of Law. He studied intellectual property, business law, and international law under the nation's top-ranked practitioners. While at UCLA Law, he served as one of two editors-in-chief of the UCLA Journal of International Law and Foreign Affairs. Before studying law, he worked as a designer and software developer, so he knows what it means to do work in the creative industry and how things actually get done. He deals with matters involving copyright, trademarks, software design, business, art law, and contracts. Jonathan speaks and writes regularly about legal issues facing technology and creative ventures, and he has given talks for the American Institute of Graphic Arts and at a variety of design and technology conferences. So, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest, Jon Tobin. Hey, Jon, welcome to Eggs.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad I can be on.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. I'm excited to have a lawyer on the show, and especially someone with creative background. You were a designer at one point. Is that correct?
Yeah, I started my first career was as a designer. So I started doing flyers and basic stuff, moved to websites, and then by the end of that career, I was designing a lot of higher end websites. I worked for Cars Direct and a lot of record labels and stuff, and so that's kind of my creative background here.
Nice. You spent some time doing web development as well.
Yeah, web development.
Like just basic WordPress stuff, or full on coding and building it from the ground up?
Full on coding, so there's obviously a lot of WordPress stuff for basic things, but then, once you're getting to larger sites, performance matters, so a lot of stuff had to be done custom.
Great.
Yeah, I think it's really great. So let's talk about your background and just sort of have you take us on your journey, right?
Yeah.
I think, the topic that you're here to discuss or this idea and the work that you do at Counsel for Creators is really interesting for me. I'm basically an art director by trade. I've been a designer my whole life. The problems that sort of surround the legal system as it pertains to creative work are so interesting to me because most people just have no idea. I think for a lot of designers, they just sort of live their whole life under this implied copyright rule that they heard once when they were in school. And I think there's a lot of interesting things to dip into. So I'm really anxious for this conversation. But maybe let's just learn a little bit about your history, where you came from, how you got started, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Yeah, sure thing. So just as I mentioned before, my first career, I was a designer, software developer. So for a long time, I'd been involved in creative industries as a creative, in the traditional sense of someone who's designing things, writing code, making new things, making software, working for startups. I did that for a while. And then at one point, I decided I wanted to try something different. So at that point, I actually went to college. And then during that time, I realized, well, hold on a second, this area like law is something that is sort of underlying everything, right? So, all of the things I was learning about in undergrad. So I was sort of doing global politics and stuff, and I was realizing, okay, all this stuff, law is underneath it, right? So anytime there's a change made to a system, it's law. And so I started thinking about how that related to creative industries when I got into law school. So I got into law school and it was like revelation after revelation. So, I'd learn about contracts or copyrights or trademarks or any of these things. And every time I'd relate it back to my earlier career, thinking if I had known that this situation that maybe happened years ago where, I didn't feel like I was treated fairly or things could have gone differently, maybe if I had known more about the legal stuff, I could have done more to sort of advocate for myself or even advocate for others. So that's kind of how it came. And then, the other thing I started realizing is the legal industry is set up to serve large companies. That's not necessarily a criticism. It's just the way it is. They're the ones who have the money to pay legal bills of $40,000 a month, $50,000 a month, and not bat an eye. So I was thinking to myself, well, how do I get this information out to people like me? So the people who are working maybe independently or for a small agency or starting a company or building a business, because a lot of this stuff I felt was really important for people to know. So that's kind of the genesis of where I wanted to go with a legal career when I was in law school.
So you went to UCLA? Is that what?
Yeah.
Okay. How was that experience and why did you pick UCLA?
So, I think the main reason for UCLA is proximity. I've grown up in LA. I'm an LA person. So I didn't really want to move. I went to college, I went to law school as an older person. So I'm already kind of established here in the city. So I'm like, I don't really want to move halfway across the country for 3 years to go to law school when I know I'm going to live in LA. Also, with what I do, LA is one of the epicenters. So it's a creative city. There's a lot of people who do the kind of work that I'm interested in working with. So, entertainment, technology, arts, there's a lot of it here. So UCLA was good for that. And then it's also, as an entertainment school, a lot of the professors are really deep in entertainment. I had a chance to learn from people who are like top tier lawyers in the entertainment industry, and to learn from them and get their perspectives was super helpful.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Your story is, for me, there's already so many lights going off, right? Because some of the things you mentioned, just, the ability to get legal services, the ability to have any understanding that you even need things. I know people 20 years into a freelance career that still don't start business with a contract and still don't, protect any of their IP, and still, don't work, take deposits or build, financial terms that are beneficial to them. There's so many things that are being missed by small creative agencies specifically. So I really love that you're doing this stuff. And I also think it's very interesting that you come to it as a former creative, as somebody who's spent the time. And it's funny because for the longest time, I saw a delineation between sort of the types of skills you might sort of associate with a lawyer, somebody who's hyper technical and maybe can, I don't know, can read and understand and ingest the law and then apply it to different situations, versus like sort of a creative person, sort of analytical versus creative, right? But it's really interesting because as you really start to think about it, the application of legal processes to a creative firm is about as creative as you could get. And so I think it's really interesting. I once shared an office with a photographer who was the type of photographer, I wouldn't say he's particularly artistic, but he was very technical, right? Like you could ask him how to take a picture and he'd explain to you how the camera was made. Right. And he is actually just now recently in the last few years transitioned into being an attorney himself. And for him, that hyper analytical ability to take apart and reassemble his camera thing was the skill set that allowed him to thrive in law school. Would you say that moving from design into sort of software development keyed you in for the, the kind of things that you would run into in law school? I just wonder if, your design skills, and having an aesthetic and all this kind of stuff, that stuff doesn't maybe seem quite as applicable to law, but that transition into software, it almost seems like you were working your way into something more analytical.
Yeah, there's definitely a spectrum there, where you have sort of the more intuitive sense when you're talking about design. And then obviously at the other end, you have the completely analytical thing. And what I like about design, and I am sort of talking more broadly here about like design of systems, is, it's people using it. So things have to be user friendly. They have to be understandable. They have to be useful. And so law is kind of that way too. You're developing these systems. So if you think about it, like corporate law, that sounds like the most dry thing in the world. Like, how is there any creativity there? But in a way, there is, because you're thinking about, well, how do you get a bunch of people with differing interests? So maybe an investor, a founder, an early employee, they all have these different interests. They all want to work together for the same goal. So how do you align those interests? How do you make it so that everybody has the same incentive and doesn't have conflict? And obviously it's going to happen, but, really what you're trying to do is design systems for people to work it, and even, if you go to the highest level, our Constitution is a system that sort of puts forth, okay, here's how we want to live. Here are the things that we value. And here is sort of the design of our system of government, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example.
Yeah, no, I think so. It's interesting, especially this topic of systems, this idea of generating processes and things like this, because it's one of those things that I feel like a lot of creatives don't really get taught, is how to go ahead and create these systems, especially if you're sort of a freelancer and maybe you're, I don't know, running a small organization. Maybe it's just you and a few people or something, and you're running your small creative agency and everything's kind of fly by the seat of your pants. Yeah. A lot of times it doesn't feel like it's necessary to implement these processes and things. And then what happens is 20 years down the road or 15 years down the road, you land a couple of big clients and my God, you're wishing you had these processes. So how does a firm like yours, step in and help, I guess, creatives understand that they have a problem to begin with, and then set them on a track to solving those kinds of problems?
Yeah, I think you kind of identified the first challenge, which is to help people understand that this is even worthwhile, like worth thinking about, because with every business, I'm sure you guys have this experience too. Everybody I've talked to does, where you have the day-to-day, things are coming up, whether it's client demands or fires to put out, technical issues, whatever it is. And so it's kind of hard to say, okay, well, pull out from that, look at things from a higher level, and let's talk about how your contracts work, right? But once you can do that, and this is a good example, like client contracts, are there certain issues or conflicts or points of friction that keep coming up? Is it always an issue that your clients, for instance, don't get you deliverables on time, so projects are stalled out because you're waiting for something? Well, there's a way you can actually put that into a system, in a contract. And, it doesn't necessarily need to be like a fully legalistic language, but I think just sort of thinking through what's something that's going to work for my clients and what's something that's going to work for me to make myself more efficient. Like, how do I take the process that's right now ad hoc and write it down and make it into something that's a little more formal, not so much that it's constricting, but enough where you don't have to make the same decision over and over every time you encounter that situation. You already know what to do. And that also allows you to bring other people in. You can tell a new hire, hey, here's how we work. Here's what our contract says. So, to the extent it's possible, try to, live up to that.
So how important is the verbiage in your contract when it comes to actually enforcing it if there is a problem? I kind of went through I'm guilty of this. My contract is 100% written by me, and it's kind of, I went and found examples of, other contracts, and I copied and pasted and changed a little bit here and there. And I feel that it's covers the basis of what I need in a DJ land and in going and doing an event. But I also feel that I always have that thought in the back of my head that if something actually does happen and I actually have to try and enforce this contract, will it stand up in court?
Yeah, to a certain degree, the verbiage matters. And what I kind of tell people is you almost scale it, right? So, and I'm honest with people that, if we're talking about like something where it's a couple $100, there's not a ton at risk. So, I don't want someone spending a ton of money with us to make a really detailed, long contract. I'd tell them, hey, just get an email with the basic terms in there and we're good. But I think as business scales, as more is at stake, and it can be at stake in different ways, then you want to sort of look at the contract and maybe adapt it, develop it a little bit more, So, I have clients who they do, projects that are 6 and 7 figures, for large companies. And so for them, their contracts are insane. The verbiage is tight, it's ultra corporate, because that's what also their clients are expecting. Their clients would be kind of weirded out if they handed them like the 2-page contract. I tell someone who's just doing like a quick photo gig for a musician, right? It's going to be a different thing. So I tell people it kind of scales based on what's at stake and how big the projects are. So, I think my point in saying that is it's not something to be intimidated by. I think a lot of people feel like, okay, I have to take this huge jump from the contract that I have or no contract and have a really big detailed contract. It's kind of a living document. You use it for a while, you find out what the weaknesses are, and then you change it. You can always change it.
Yeah, I recently just added a section in there that if you do a mic drop with my microphone, I'm going to bill you $300
Yeah.
just for, even if it doesn't
There you
damage
go.
the mic. The
Yeah.
thought of, like, hey, that's just disrespectful. I don't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go in another route. Let's talk about setting up a business and the process of doing that correctly. Sole prop versus LLC
Yeah.
versus all that other crazy stuff. Can you kind of just walk us through like an initial consult with someone who is setting up their business?
Yeah, usually one of the first things I talk to people about is who's involved, right? So there's sort of, I'd say, like a decision point where you kind of look one direction if you have one person in the company, and then you look in a different direction if there's more than one person, right? So with one person, and again, it's also going to depend upon where they are. So if I have people who have been in business for a long time and they're doing larger projects, and so my answer is going to be different. And if it's if it's a group of people, my answer is going to be different. Whether they're taking on investors, whether they're going to have multiple founders. So you have things like LLCs and corporations that can facilitate a group of people working together. And so at the core of that, what you have is an agreement. So, let's just say the three of us decided right now, hey, we want to start something together. We'd want an agreement that says, okay, here's what everybody's putting in. Here's everyone's responsibilities. Here is what happens if one of us wants to leave. Here's what, everybody can do. Here are the rights. Here's how we make decisions. So it's really, to me, what I've sort of learned, the first question is, what's the agreement among everybody involved, right? And then you sort of create an entity around that. And again, that can be an LLC, that can be a corporation, and each of them has their own advantages and disadvantages. Like an LLC is really simple to set up and get moving. But as far as like flexibility and having different classes of shareholders, it has less, right? So, again, that's why, if you look at a startup or something, they're always choosing things like Delaware C corporations, because all investors know how those work. They know that they can get a class of shares, preferred stock that they're used to taking in their business. So if you're taking on investors, I say, great, do a Delaware C corporation. If it's just you're like in the entertainment industry, might be an S corporation, because that's also going to get you tax benefits. So, the easy answer is it depends. But then the sort of expanding on that is it really depends on what you're doing, and just there's different courses of action depending on how complex your business is at the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I just recently went through this process and set up an LLC for me, and I did it myself, just kind of reading through the state guidelines and what I need to do and all that. But I've also heard that, like you want to file in Nevada for this reason, or you want to do this. How important is it to actually file in your state versus filing in Nevada or Delaware or this or that for the small guy? If you're not a huge business, does it make any difference?
Yeah, it's funny because that's a question that I would say, as long as I've been doing this comes up, every few weeks. Someone comes to me and asks me the same question. And the answer is, what I tell people, the default answer, file in the state where you're going to do business. The reason why, and so I'll have people who are like, I want to do like an, Wyoming LLC or Nevada LLC or whatever, because it doesn't have any, let's say, income taxes or taxes on the LLC. Thing is, what people don't know sometimes is the state where you live is still going to have taxes, right? So let's say I incorporated in Wyoming and they're like, cool, man, you don't have to pay us anything. California is still going to tell me where I live. Okay, so we saw that you made some money last year. Where's our cut? Sure. when I file with the IRS. So they're going to, they're still going to want it. And it's easier to have it in your own state, because then there's just one less layer of sort of administration, and so yeah.
With me, I live in Idaho, right?
Yeah.
But 90% of the work I do is in Washington, and then another 20% is in Utah, and another 2% is actually in the state that I work in. Does that have any play in the decision, or is it 100% based on where you actually reside?
It's kind of where you're doing business. There's a lot of different ways you can look at it. And, again, as companies get bigger, it changes. So, let's just say you're a Delaware corporation, I'm just going to pick, I don't know if Amazon is, but let's just say, for example, Amazon it's doing business in all 50 states. No state is going to say, hey, we don't want, if they collect taxes on online revenue, no state is going to say, we don't want taxes from you. They're all going to want taxes, right? And so kind of as your business grows, what you sort of have is this nexus with each state that gets bigger and bigger, this sort of connection to each state, where at a certain point, they're going to say, okay, hold on, you made like $50 million from California residents last year. We need to talk about taxes here. And ideally you want to talk about that before they tell you, because
Sure.
by the time they tell you, they're like, and by the way, there's penalties,
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to dip into, and I think it's kind of related to this, is sort of this idea of when is the time. So I think that, I guess in a perfect world, there's a right way to set up a business that, if you've sort of got this long-term vision that you think you're going to be successful and you think it's going to be great, like there's an ideal way to start a business. But I think what happens for a lot of people, especially those who maybe, work in-house someplace, then become a freelancer, through a layoff or whatever, and then stay freelance for a while. And suddenly they're kind of in business, but they're kind of just trying to make do.
Yeah.
When is the time that they should really start looking at organizing a business? Like, is there a dollar amount figure? Is there amount of time served? Like, at what point does it make sense to start looking at organization? Is it, for so long you can do things, you can file, an extension, or not an extension, but there's an add-on that you can do to your taxes, your personal taxes, to, account for sort of some small business earnings and losses. But at some point it makes sense to make a transition. Is there sort of a clean delineation or a point when you would recommend somebody make a transition and get organized?
Yeah. I mean, what I also tell people is that this is, again, sort of like I was saying with contracts, this is a little bit of an organic process. So, one answer is on day one, you might want to start with some organization, or just be aware of what you might want to do down the road. And so with a lot of people that I work with, especially now, people who maybe don't have a job or got furloughed. I mean, I've had, in the last couple of months, it's been crazy. I've had so many people who have come to me. They're like, okay, I'm finally starting my business because I don't have a job, right? And so what I tell them is, okay, you might not need to do everything now, and especially if money's tight, I get that. But I just want to let you know, here are the things you want to look at, for the next 6 months or in the next year, and here are the benefits. Here's how much it's going to cost. And so then I sort of let people make that decision on their own. I sort of guide them. I'm like, hey, if you set up an LLC, you're going to get that limited liability protection. You might get certain write-offs because, you're an entity, or be able to apply for certain loans or whatever. So depending on what the benefits are, the timing is going to differ. And I had one client, and this is actually a really common scenario, where their first day in business, they have a huge client. Maybe they started their business because, they have some client who maybe they met at their job who's like, I like you, I want to work with you. And by the way, here's $100,000 contract. They're not going to give that to just a sole proprietor. They want you to have an LLC and be set up and be a stable business. And so, we'll set up an LLC on day one, because that company wants to work with an LLC. They're like, we don't work with sole proprietors. We work only with LLCs or corporations. So get one so that we can work with you. So, it's always the lawyer cop-out answer is it depends, but I'm trying to give more context in terms of it's going to differ. And what I usually tell people is a good idea is just, you talk with an attorney and kind of find out like, okay, what's my strategy here? What's my game plan?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. And I think that's why I'm trying to explore this idea of when is the time, because I think for a lot of people, especially younger creatives who are kind of getting out into their, just starting to get their feet wet and probably starting with small projects, and there's minimal risk involved. So maybe it's okay to not, get organized right out of the jump. But definitely as time goes on and income starts coming in, and, the more you make, the more you're looking for tax benefit and things like that, it makes sense that you would grow. Also, I suppose it's sort of in parallel with the need of a contract, right? I know in a perfect world, it would be day one, job one, you would have a contract in place, that kind of thing. But I think the reality for a lot of people, especially when they sort of are working from a place of scarcity, where it's, we get a bunch of work, then we're looking for work for 6 months and that kind of thing. It gets really easy to get really sloppy on process, that kind of thing, because it's you don't even think about your contract just because, my God, somebody finally is going to pay me to do something. So I'm going to knock it out, or, we'll fix this, or we'll do whatever. So I think that's really good insight.
Yeah, I think it's part of the growth as a business owner too. A lot of people, if you're a creative, maybe you come into business, you're not really thinking of yourself as a business owner. You're a graphic designer, or you're a software developer, mobile app developer, architect. And so, as you sort of go on, you start to take on more of the role as business owner, because you realize, well, if I want to make more money, if I want to do better jobs, I do have to start setting up these systems.
Can you talk a little bit about partnerships and working with another person? I've have a lot of friends actually who kind of jump into projects with, hey, we're homies, let's just do this. And then they start making money and all of a sudden, now what? Can you talk about, say, if you have an existing business and they have a business and you're working together, how that works?
It's cool. There's a lot of ways to do it. But there's a few principles behind it that I've talked with a lot of people about, which are, number one, you can always scale things, right? So, I've seen a lot of people where, they talk with someone and, they're really getting along well. And then the next move is, hey, let's jump in and form a company together, right? Sometimes I've had the conversation where I'm like, well, how well do you know this person? Maybe you met them 3 weeks ago and they're really cool, but maybe start with a small project and see how that goes. Start with let's do a project together. And if that works well, let's do another one. And if that works well, let's expand our collaboration. So again, you have that sort of organic approach here.
Yeah. But is it the 10th project that you decide, okay, let's actually form something here? Or can you keep going independent on your own and then kind of figure it out when the time comes? That seems more like the wrong way to do it, in my opinion.
Yeah. So I can actually, a good story is of myself and my business partner. So, in my law firm, I have a partner. So we met, I think it was like 2015, right? So, a friend of ours connected us. He's like, hey, you guys kind of think the same and you have the same, mission here. So you guys should know each other. So then we started working on projects, right? So I was more emphasizing on trademarks and branding and he knew more about corporate law. So we'd kind of work on clients together. Okay, I got this client and they also need a company. So you set up the company, I'll do the trademarks. We realized we work well together. So then what we started doing is having a series of conversations. We probably did it on overkill because we're lawyers, right? So but we did go through, what the key is to have the hard conversations about money. Yeah. About what happens if somebody just completely drops the ball, it's really about the conversations that you have. And so we talk about things like how much money do we have to put in to start this business? Let's put a number on it. How are the profits split? How are decisions made? Right. So, if I want to do something and you don't, how do we rectify that? And so I think having those conversations is really helpful because I tell people, once the money comes in, once the money is there and the stakes are higher, then it gets more emotional. Yeah. That's where it becomes like, well, I thought you said this. No, I was 30-70, man. And don't you remember? No, I thought it was 50-50, people's memories change. And this is another thing, over time, you might have a conversation, not write it down, let's say in January. And then by July, everyone's forgotten what that conversation was. And so then you have these differing recollections and that's what leads to conflicts.
Can you set it up in a way where you don't have to necessarily create an entity for the partnership, but there's just a legal contract between the two that says, hey, this is your role, this is my role, this is the split, this is how it works. And if that's the case, how does banking work?
Yeah. So you can actually, you can kind of scale these entities. So you can actually have something called like a partnership agreement where, again, if we're like, hey, let's put together, a book or a video series and we just wanted to do that right now, we could say, look, here's what you're going to do. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's how much money you're going to put in. Here's how much I'm going to put in. And that's an agreement. That's a legal agreement. That's an agreement that's going to help us understand what our responsibilities are and our rights are. But then if we're like, hey, that actually has some traction, then we can develop that. We can develop that into an entity. We can say, okay, well, now it makes sense to maybe set up a corporation that has its own bank account. All the money goes in there. You get 50% of what's left. I get 50% of what's left. And then you can build up to that.
That makes sense. So as someone coming in a situation like that, is your own personal legal representation important, or can a partnership come to you and set this up without having the need to have, I have my lawyer, you have yours, let's meet in the middle? Is that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So you kind of have this weird situation where sometimes you're the lawyer for one person or the other, and so it could be that someone's joining a company and they come to me and are like, hey, I want you to look over this agreement, that I'm going to be entering into. A lot of times though, what happens is I'm the lawyer for the company. Right. So let's say you two were forming a new company. You might come to me and say, I'm forming a company, and it's so-and-so LLC. I'd then be the lawyer for so-and-so LLC. So both the owners, you actually, in a weird way, you can't keep anything from either owner. So, if someone comes to me on the side and says, hey, by the way, trying to get rid of this guy, I can't like take a side in that. I have to say, hey, okay, so it sounds like you guys have a difference of opinion. My job is to make the LLC work. So here's what I'm hearing from you. Here's what I'm hearing from you. And then if there are truly differing considerations, I'd probably say you guys, maybe each of you should get a lawyer because that's the time for it. But ultimately, my job initially is to make that entity work. So that's why you have lawyers who work for corporations, and you'll have a lawyer who's the lawyer for the actual legal entity, not for the CEO or the board. They can all retain their own attorney, and they often do. So like if you're a CEO being hired by a company, you're going to hire a lawyer to look over your executive compensation package, right? Because your interests are different in that case than they are from the company.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one topic I wanted to get into with you, just because this is actually something that happened to me last year, and I think it's probably really common for a lot of small firms, is how the topic of sort of reclaiming lost income, or when somebody doesn't want to pay.
Yeah.
And so basically what happened in our case, we had a client, we'd done about $30,000 worth of work. They disagreed with the price, or had decided that they didn't want to do that. And they basically paid a third of it, and then sort of just washed their hands of it, walked away. And I talked to a couple, attorney buddies and stuff like that. Nobody with specific expertise in creative, but still just sort of people in this area. And basically they told me that for $20,000, it probably wasn't worth taking them to court and fighting over this whole thing. Now part of the problems, as we've alluded to, we had a very minimal contract. Basically, it didn't, in this particular instance, it didn't cap the amount of money per month. And that's where they were sticking, was saying that verbally we had agreed to an amount of money per month. And they felt like we had exceeded that, even though that wasn't actually in the terms of a relationship. And so that was sort of the leg they were standing on. And so, but, we had worked the hours, we'd done the time, we didn't have anything, and actually we had email documentation to the contrary that actually wasn't the deal. And, but still I was told, by my attorney friends that it just, for that amount of money, we'd end up burning it mostly in legal costs anyway. And by the end of the day, just be grateful we got something and walk away. And so I wonder if you just have a perspective on that, for the freelancer, for the small business who, loses something or a client refuses to pay, how you might approach that, in a small business.
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's something, it comes up a lot. It's one of those repeating themes in the work that I do. And, I sometimes, kind of like you're alluding to, I have to have this very pragmatic conversation, where it might be that you're completely right and we could go to court and show that we're completely right, but it's not free. You're going to have to hire like a litigator, someone who can do that for you, and they're not necessarily cheap. So, just assuming there's no, the contract isn't the way that I would, I'd want it to be or whatever. Sometimes we have that discussion where, maybe there's a portion of it that is just going to, that's going to be fine. And then you kind of use that as a learning experience of, okay, what can I do to avoid that happening in the future? Because I've had people who, they've been ready to go on the warpath for $500. And I'm like, so, let's just say it was free. Like, do you want to spend the next 6 months of your life being distracted by getting that $500? Or do you want to take that energy and point it towards bringing on a new client who's actually going to pay you on time? And so you kind of have that pragmatic, and obviously it matters more as the money gets higher, and it's weird. You kind of allude to this. There's actually this kind of middle ground where it's, unless you have the contract set up in a certain way, it's really, really, really hard to get a lawyer to do it, because it's easy at the low end because you can go to small claims, at least in California. And I think most states have it where if it's under a certain amount, you can actually go to court and represent yourself. So I tell a lot of people, hey, if it's $2,000, just go to small claims, file a small claim suit, show up at the hearing, show your contract, and get an order for that $2,000. That's cool. You get to 20,000, or let's just say 50,000, you're out of that realm. Now you can't use small claims because you're above the money limit, but you're also below the amount where it's going to make sense to hire an attorney. So kind of what you do, the solution to that is sort of preventative, right? So you're looking at things like in contracts, I have people put attorney fees clauses. So if we do have to go and chase someone down for money, you can kind of say, hey, just so you know, the longer this goes on, the more I'm paying this attorney, and that bill is going to come to you at some point. So that what that does is it really drives the other person to want to settle, more quickly instead of dragging things out. Like, okay. You can also do things where, this is something we do in a lot of our contracts, is make it so that things like the IP, the rights to use the work that has been created, is contingent on full payment. So that's, you kind of create these leverage points so that if you do have a conflict, you can use those to your advantage.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in our situation, we did just end up walking away.
Yeah.
And but just as it pertains to business formation and some other things, maybe this is something that people can use. I walked away on the assumption that, we'll be able to take that as a loss this year anyway. And so, yes, I can reuse this time in better ways. Yes, we should we'll just go find more work and replace this work, and we'll, discontinue work for this particular client. But I was working, or just in my own head, I was like, okay, well, that's a loss. We'll take it as a loss. Then, at tax time, I run it by the CPA, and CPA goes, oh, well, you're on a cash basis, not an accrual basis. So you can't write off that loss because you never actually had the money. It wasn't there in the first place. And so, but that had to do with the way that our business was organized. And so, it makes sense for sort of a small to mid-sized firm to be on a cash basis the way we are, but then you don't get those longer term benefits. So I guess it makes, or is it an argument for knowing your business better?
Yeah, it's just kind of, I think, learning about business, having the relationship, in this case, it sounds like even with an accountant or a tax person, CPA, who can sort of tell you, hey, here's the upside and downside of cash basis or accrual basis, or how you want to structure your taxes or your contracts or when you receive money. And so, I think as people's businesses develop, they start to have closer relationships with these people. Which is why you see, at large companies, every company over a certain size has in-house counsel. They have an in-house, financial person, because these are the things that, that person's salary can be paid in one sort of transaction. That goes, like, let's say there's you can make something $1 million loss, where it wasn't before. That person just paid their salary for the year. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about trademarks. That's another thing that you guys do, and something that you focus on. I personally have a DJ brand that I've thought about trademarking in the past. There's one other person that started using my name and my handle, for example, in the Philippines, and that's international, which it probably wouldn't even apply. Even if I had a trademark here in the States, they could still do whatever they want. But how important is it to trademark your brand, and is it worth doing if you're just a small guy?
Yeah. So what's interesting about trademark is every brand, all right? So any brand that's out there, you have a trademark. You have trademark rights as you're using it. So now what a lot of people then are wondering is, okay, when you're talking about trademarking a brand, what that actually means is like federal registration of your trademark. So when you do that federal registration, it takes the trademark rights that you've developed just through usage, like the brand goodwill that you have, and then amplifies that, right? So it gives you more legal rights. It gives you, like, for instance, national priority, which means if anyone anywhere in the country uses it, you can stop them. Where if you don't have it, you can only stop them in the places where you've already used it. Nowadays, it's become really important because on social media, if you have a registered trademark, if you've actually registered it, you can get someone taken down like in a couple days. So if that person in the Philippines goes on Instagram and gets the handle for the DJ name that you have, you can go to them and say, hey, I have a registered trademark, take that down, actually transfer that person's account to me, send all their followers to me. So you get these kind of extra powers. But it's what I tell people is you already have the trademark. You already have it just by using it. And then the question is, when to register it. And I tell people, again, it's one of those things you kind of have to decide on your own. It's just, it's a matter of budgeting. So for some people, I'm like, hey, if you don't have the money to do it, okay, that's fine. But if you do, if it's available, then I usually tell people as soon as you feel like you have the budget or the financial means to do it, you go ahead and do it.
What's an average cost for a trademark, and how often do you have to update it, renew it?
Yeah.
And what kind of fees are associated with the update process?
Yeah. So usually, to get it done right, you're looking at spending between like $1,000 up to $3,000, $4,000 to get it registered. Right now, that higher number is in the case of if you go to like a larger law firm, or if your mark has difficulties. So sometimes you go to register a trademark and there's another mark that's involved and you have to, argue with the trademark office. So sometimes the costs go up. But for a lot of people, you might be looking between $1,000 and $2,000 just to get all that in there. And then every 5 years, after the first 5 years, you have to renew. so you renew and that's a few $100s with the USPTO. And then every 10 years after that, indefinitely. So as long as you're using the trademark, you can keep renewing that trademark. So at the USPTO. And so, again, it's really, I tell people it's really about getting that usage down, like making sure that you're using it consistently, sort of going with, what's just generally considered good branding, being consistent and open about your brand.
So I pretty much think I know the answer to this already, but I just want to clarify with you. So like my DJ name is DJ Ontic, right? There's also an aviation company that uses Ontic, and there's a golf club company that uses Ontic, and there's a few other people that use that term. There's no way I could go after them and say, hey, I want your domain, or I want this because I did it first and I have, proof that I did it first. They're in a different industry, so it doesn't even matter, right?
Yeah, that's what it's all about. I mean, the sort of core thing about trademark, it's about consumer confusion, right? So the question you always have to ask yourself is, would the average consumer be confused that, let's say, an aircraft company and a DJ are the same source? The answer is probably not. I mean, there might be instances where that is true, but in most cases, it's not. And so like the example I always use is there's Delta Airlines and there's Delta Faucets.
Yeah.
Because these are in such different industries, there's no conflict there. Now, sometimes you have these weird situations where, like when Apple gets into music, it was a whole issue because the Beatles publishing label is called Apple. So then, they had to sort of sort that one out.
Interesting. Yeah, makes sense. Let's talk about your pricing, how your business works. I think on your website, I saw it's $95 a month. And does that, hey, I'm going to jump on me. I'm going to pay $100. You're going to take care of all my stuff, and I'm going to have a legal issue that I have to go to court for. Obviously, there's some sort of like limitations to that.
Yeah, for sure. So the way it works is, kind of like we've been saying this whole conversation, it's really about having that guidance, to sort of develop that plan and sort of organically understand, okay, what do you need to do and what can you kind of forget about right now, right? And so the $95 a month is so people can come to us and ask us questions freely without worrying about billing, without being like, I don't want to talk to these guys because, I know that if I get on the phone, it's going to be like $300 or whatever, right? So we figured that's a good way to do it because, and also even with our clients who, we work on like project basis for, they'll have these random questions in between. And we're like, hey, we want to answer those. And so here's an easy way to do that. So with the $95 a month that's just to sort of be able to call us, send in documents, sort of get general legal support that I think any company would want. And then for things like setting up a company or doing a trademark, we do flat fee project packages. So depending on what the business is, it's going to be, it's going to be more investment. But, again, what we do is someone working with us, if let's say they're, a member of our subscription, we'll tell them, hey, in the next year, you should probably do a trademark registration. Here's how much that will cost you. So just plan ahead and think about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. Can you also talk about, as part of that relationship, let's say, for example, like, I could probably stand to have some new contracts done up for like our agency. So like if we wanted to try and retain something with you, how do you approach that kind of thing? Like I assume there's some kind of general things that are maybe in most contracts or all contracts even, but how do you determine like what would make ours unique? Or do you use just one master template for just about everybody?
Yeah, so what we do is we start with like, at the back end, there's sort of like a master template, right, with a lot of variation. So just over time, we've sort of figured out, okay, here are the sort of places that things might need to be changed. But really the process in working with us on a contract, for instance, is more of the conversations that we have beforehand, helping the business owner pin down exactly how they want to work. So, do they want a clause where they can terminate their client relationship for no reason, just by giving 7-day notice to their client? Say, hey, it's not working, no reason, just don't feel like working with you anymore. Here's notice, and we're going to wrap it up now. Do you want that? Do you want things like arbitration? Do you want attorney fees? Stuff like that. So we have those conversations, or and then we talk about things like indemnification, like what happens if you're a client, and I've seen this happen. They'll give the designer like photos that are infringing on copyright, and then the person who took the photos comes after everybody, including the designer. So what protection can we put so that so that if you do get into that situation, you can get out quickly,
Yeah, that's something that I think a lot of people don't actually think about. I sure wouldn't. I'm not in the design field, and myself, I'm guilty of just finding an image on Google and using it for another purpose. And as a designer, I'm sure, like if you're doing a big ad for a health agency or Coca-Cola or these guys, and all of a sudden it's on this $1 million budget to go out nationwide, I'm sure that the photographer is going to see it and cause a problem. So
yeah, and it happens pretty consistently. I mean, I think it's one of those things where, let's just say an ad campaign for a large company, you're going to have like a design firm, you're going to maybe even have some middle, some ad agency that hires the design firm, and then the final client, all of them sort of thinking, well, I thought you checked out the photograph, so they haven't really sort of got that process in place, and then nobody checks it out, and it goes up on the billboard. A photographer's friend drives by, they take a picture, they send it to the photographer, and be like, hey, I didn't know your photos on the, like the new Apple campaign, and they're like, hey, I didn't know that either, And then, a lawsuit occurs. And then what happens is, when I first started practicing, I was doing, litigation. The basic move is you just sue everybody. Everybody who touched the project, you go after, because you don't know. Like at that point, you don't really know, like whose fault was it? I don't know, but I'm going to go after everyone to find out,
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, because, stock photography is one of these, areas where people get stuck all the time. And especially if the photo comes from, maybe one of these bigger suppliers like a Getty or a Shutterstock or something like that. Those guys take their copyrights pretty seriously.
Yeah.
And so, so even though you can flippantly grab something off the internet and throw it out there, you really could be putting yourself in a different situation. Yeah. The other one that stands out to me that's sort of commonly overlooked is fonts.
Right.
Like the fonts that are used in a layout. Almost without exception, every client I've ever had will always ask for the fonts that you use to lay out their stuff. And, essentially what happens is you as the agency or you as the designer typically will buy that font, and you own the license and you're allowed to use it for the purposes of your work. But if you distribute it, then all of a sudden you're in breach, and then you can really open yourself up to some problems. So I guess those might be the kinds of terms laid out in like a master service agreement, that kind of thing, that we won't be supplying fonts, we won't be supplying photography, there will be some indemnification, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Because those are the things. And then, with the contract, it's, it's worth making sure that your client as the agency understands that, if you want to take this photograph that we're doing for this print ad and do a series of web ads, maybe you need a different license, right? So you kind of tell them, hey, I'm going to give you the license you need for the project, but if you're taking it to another level, you need to get a different license. You need to upgrade your license or whatever.
Yeah. So in putting together then a contract like that, I mean, do you, if you're working with clients and things like that, do you generally offer like multiple contracts? Like, would you have one for different type, each type of job or whatever, or would you just have sort of one master service agreement that you might use for everything?
Well, I'm sure it would depend based on the project itself. If you're doing a web project, it's probably going to differ from like a basic layout for a flyer or for an image. Is that correct? Would you want to kind of approach it differently based on the project?
Yeah, you can do it that way. And one of the cool ways that we've sort of been able to do it, and I think this is probably the best way, and I think most lawyers are going to do it this way, is you have like you have the agreement, right? And so that's going to be the terms of the relationship, if you think about it that way. Like this is how, as client and designer, this is how we're going to work together, right? So this is how we terminate. This is how payment works. These are all sort of the logistical things, right? And then what you do is you attach a statement of work to that agreement for every project. And so let's say that, you have someone who hires you for a flyer. You say, hey, here's the flyer. Like, here are the specs, here's, how many, different versions I'm going to make for you. Here's how many revisions it's going to be, and here's how much it's going to cost, and that's sort of attached. And then for the website, you might attach that and be like, hey, here's the specs, here's how much it's going to cost, here's the timeline, and so then the main agreement always refers back, and it's going to say, the fees paid are detailed in the statement of work. And so you kind of have almost like with software and coding, you kind of have these libraries that you're referring back to all the time.
So like with the project, and you lay it out and you have this definitive kind of like, oh, it's going to take 20 hours to do, this is how much it's going to cost. How do you, is it written into the contract initially if you have like, overage and under, like if you estimate it's 20 hours of work, but it ends up taking 30, is that initially kind of just something an overlay in the contract? You say, hey, any additional hours is charged at this amount of time, or how would something like that work?
Yeah, you can do it that way. So, if you're doing some sort of model where your income is based on hours, you might say, I'm going to give you 20 hours at this price, right? So it's going to, maybe my fee is $100 an hour. So for 20 hours, we're doing $2,000. But also no, my hourly rate is 100. So I'm assuming we're doing 20. So if it goes to 21, it's 2,100. If it goes to 22, it's 2,200, or you might have something where even if it's a flat fee, let's just say it's a flat fee, 2,000, we're not specifying hours. Here's what you're getting. You're getting like one design and then 3 revisions or whatever. Maybe you say that, any revisions beyond 3 will be billed at an hourly rate of $100 an hour. So, and kind of what that does is it sets the sort of tone of the relationship. So if that client is like really picky and they have a lot of revisions, that's fine. And it's fine that they know that they're going to be charged extra.
Yeah, I think, both of the scenarios you just described are sort of how we handle it. We will typically, our big thing is transparency, right? So we want to make sure that they understand that if they go over, it's going to cost extra. And so we always preface it though with, we'll require a updated scope of work or an updated statement of work just to say, okay, we've hit the maximum, we've hit 20 hours. Now we need 10 more, or whatever, but we're going to need an updated document to authorize these additional 10 hours. Versus just going over. And actually, this was sort of born from that scenario we were talking about earlier where we had gone, dramatically over what they expected. And that ended up causing a problem. If we'd have gone to them at this number they expected, which unfortunately wasn't known to us before that relationship. Had we known that, though, we could have at least negotiated that and said, okay, we've hit that limit. Now we think we need more. And have that discussion. And so we find that generally speaking, just more communication is better than less. Yeah, communication and transparency. You said it. It's really, with contracts, I sort of look at it. The central principle is about being transparent. It's a tool that you want to use to make sure that everybody knows what's being agreed to and knows up front, knows before they get too deep in. And then there's money at stake. We want everybody, if you have a client who doesn't like the idea that they're going to be charged for extra revisions, you want to know before you make those revisions. You want to know before your team, invests the time to make revisions that someone's going to not want to pay for.
Yeah. I kind of want to go down another topic as far as who retains the right to media. So say, for example, you're creating an audiobook or you're that's something I've been kind of dabbling in lately is I've been doing some voiceovers for audiobooks and doing the vocal talent. How important is it to kind of just like, I've never done this before. So there's little things that I haven't thought of or come into that, say I spend 4 hours working on a demo for the client. Can I use that demo as a portfolio for me when it's his book that I'm doing the overview for? Is that something that would be an issue?
Yeah. Again, I think it always comes back to that communication, and so, again, with a lot of my design clients, I'll have the same thing where they're like, I'm designing this for this client and they're going to have all the rights to it, but I want to also put it in my portfolio. And so what I tell people is, okay, let's just make sure they know up front that's what you want to do, because also you want to know beforehand, right? So if your client's like, absolutely not, no way, you can't do it. Okay, now you can kind of plan accordingly. And maybe that's not the project that you use as a demo, but another one is. And you might even say, hey, look, I'll give you, 10% off or 5% off if I can take an excerpt of your audiobook that, that you've created and I'm reading, and use it as a demo, or just, maybe they do it for free. But the point is I think just having that conversation up front, because I've seen situations where somebody just goes ahead and does it. And then the client gets really angry and, starts sending threatening letters, and that's no fun.
Yeah. One of the companies I work for, it's a requirement that you have to do like a read through and send it to the client, and they have to approve it, yes or no. And if they approve it, then you got the work.
Yeah.
But it's kind of frustrating sometimes to spend 2 hours doing this demo for them, and then they say no, and you're just out. It would be nice to use that as like, hey, here's part of my resume, and just throw it up there. But not evidently, they wrote the book. It's their material for me to go and just read it and just say, hey, here's my take on this. I see that.
Yeah. That's why I have some clients who as design firms, they'll even do like internal projects. And the reason why is they want to show off, what they can do. So maybe they do like a project. I'm going to do like a project about all the different kind of trees in my neighborhood. And it sounds corny or whatever, but the point is now they can show future clients, hey, here's the kind of work that we do. Here's the level that we're on.
Do you do anything as far as this is a whole nother kind of type of law, but like I think it's called Creative Commons.
Yeah.
So there's in the DJ world, there's a lot of DJs that will do remixes of a song, for example, or they'll take a song and add a kick drum and a snare drum and edits of that. If you take someone else's song and you manipulate it to a certain extent, is it technically manipulated to a point where you can use it on your own and be okay to get away with that?
So the music industry will tell you, no, if you use the song at all in any way, even like a 1 second drum or like stab from one of their songs, their answer is going to be no, pay us, and it also kind of depends on the artist too. So like, there's a lot of artists who maybe if they're sampling, but they'll actually go and they'll talk to the original, 70s musician who made that song and be like, hey man, we like your work. We want to use it in this track we're doing. So, can we get your permission, and maybe there's some money involved or not, whatever. But, I think the general rule is if you're using someone else's material, you want to make sure that you have some kind of permission.
Yeah, it's so hard as a DJ though, because you're always using someone else's material from start to finish, and you kind of want to create your own brand, your own identity based on that. And I'm guilty of this. I'll take a song and redrum it and use it, but I don't necessarily give it out to other people. It's my own kind of collection. But there's a lot of rumors and hearsay of like, oh, as long as you do this and that to it, you're good and it's okay. When, I think there's no real definitive answer other than the label coming at you when there's a problem.
Yeah, there's always a risk potential. There's always a potential that the person who wrote the song, or more accurately, probably the label that owns the rights, is going to come. But, I think it's also balanced by the fact that, they don't want to shut down every single DJ who's playing their music. That doesn't look good, and it means that fewer people hear the actual music, So I think there's balancing going on there. And and then you kind of see situations on YouTube where like DJ mixes will be taken down because maybe one person complained there's like 18 songs on the mix, but then one person's like, no, I never want my song played in a DJ mix ever under any circumstances. And they do a DMCA takedown. Yeah.
There's a huge issue right now with DJs that are actually, we're out of work. With this COVID thing, we don't have work coming in. We're sitting here broke, and we're trying to do live streams on Facebook, and their algorithm listens to every single song and pulls it down because, it's God forbid it's streaming on Facebook.
Yeah,
and it's really interesting how everyone sees that. But in parting shots, can you give a brief overview where people can find you and how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Jon Tobin. I'm one of the founders and a partner at a law firm called Counsel for Creators. We're in Los Angeles. People can go to counselforcreators.com and you can find us there. I'm also on Twitter under Jon Tobin LA. So those are the kind of the two places people can go and check us out, see what we do.
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jon. This has been an awesome conversation. Lots of really good information. And I encourage everyone to cruise over to counselforcreators.com. Check it out. We've got a really cool subscription program that sort of puts legal in reach for a lot of people, and I think it's worth checking out. So thanks to everybody who tuned in this week and every week. And thank you, Jon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.